cold, damp chill of winter hung in the sky over central Mississippi on February 4th, 1986. It was not a day of particular significance in the city of Forest, the county seat of Scott County. But within a short time it would be. By late evening, the events of the day would launch a mystery that haunted Mississippi for decades. On this fateful day, rape, murder, and mystery would fall upon the residents of this rural community, leaving scars that remained unhealed for nearly 40 years. Before we go into Shondra May's story, I want to ask you something straight. Here in America, we pride ourselves on justice, on not letting victims be forgotten. But think about this: if you're watching right now and you just move on without acting, without even hitting subscribe, then you're silently letting stories like Shondra's fade into the dark. 17 years old, a girl with her whole life ahead of her, taken, silenced. And if we don't keep her memory alive, what does that say about us as a community, as a nation that claims to care? So don't scroll past. Don't stay silent. Do the right thing now. Subscribe and stand up for Shondra and for every American family still waiting for justice. 17-year-old Shondra Denise May lived with her mother, father, and adopted brother, Tim, in a quiet, unincorporated community of Scott County known as Pea Ridge. It was not much more than a cluster of homes, a place off the main highway, a pocket of country life where everyone knew one another. Nestled off Highway 35 North in northern Scott County, just shy of the Leake County line, it was the sort of place where neighbors could recognize your car by the sound of its engine, where routine was steady, predictable, and safe, at least until that February night. Her father, Richard May, worked as a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River. His job kept him away for long stretches of time, navigating barges and cargo along the country's great waterway. This left Shondra's mother, Janelle, to shoulder most of the parenting at home. Those who knew the family recalled Janelle as steady, strong, and deeply committed to her children. Friends and relatives often said she managed to maintain a stable, loving environment, even with Richard away so often. From all accounts, Shondra was a bright and kind young woman, the kind of daughter parents dream of raising. She was hardworking, respectful, and already demonstrating a sense of independence. People close to her described her as caring, someone who could be counted on to do the right thing, someone whose potential seemed limitless. At the time, Shondra was a senior at Leake Academy, a private school in the small community of Madden, Mississippi, about 14 miles northeast of her home. She was in her final semester, eagerly anticipating graduation just a few months away. The final stretch of high school should have been filled with excitement about the future. College applications, prom, senior photos. But instead her story was cut short. Shondra kept a busy schedule. School filled her weekdays, but she also worked part-time at the McDonald's in Forest, about 13 miles south of Pea Ridge. It was a common after-school job for teenagers in the area, especially since the restaurant's location off Interstate 20 brought in steady traffic. For Shondra, the job was more than a paycheck. It was her way of showing responsibility, gaining experience, and helping out her family where she could. On February 4th, 1986, her day began like any other. She attended her classes at Leake Academy in the morning. That evening, she arrived at McDonald's and clocked in for her shift at 6 p.m. Witnesses later recalled nothing unusual. No strange behavior, no tension. To them, it was just another night in the life of a teenage worker. But in hindsight, every detail of that shift has been revisited again and again, as investigators, journalists, and family members tried to piece together her final movements. Forest, Mississippi, was not a bustling city. In 1986, it had a population of just over 5,000. The wider Scott County population was around 20,000. In such a rural place, a franchise like McDonald's was a symbol of both modernity and opportunity. Its location just off I-20 ensured that truckers, travelers, and locals alike would pass through, grabbing a meal before heading back onto the highway. For young people like Shondra, the restaurant represented steady work and a chance to interact with the wider world. But February 4th was quiet. It was a Tuesday, and the weather worked against the usual dinner traffic. Cold, damp rain kept many at home. By 7:24 p.m., Just over an hour into her shift, Shondra clocked out because of the slow business. Still, she lingered. Like many teens, she wanted to make as many hours as possible, and perhaps she hoped the pace might pick up later. For a while, she waited. Finally, at about 7:40 p.m., Shondra decided to leave. Before stepping out into the cold, she made a phone call. Using the restaurant phone, she rang her mother, letting her know she was on her way home. It was a small, ordinary detail, but it would become chilling in retrospect. It was the last time anyone close to her heard her voice. As she walked out of the McDonald's that evening, the young brunette, hazel-eyed and full of life, had no way of knowing that she would never make it home. She had only 13 miles to travel along familiar roads, a drive she had made countless times before. But somewhere in that short stretch between the bright lights of Forest and the darkened back roads of Pea Ridge, Shondra vanished. The town of Forest, Mississippi, was not the sort of place where danger lurked behind every corner. With a population hovering just above 5,000 in 1986, it was a kind of community where most people knew one another, or at least recognized familiar faces in grocery aisles at church or across the bleachers at a Friday night football game. Yet for all its quiet charm, Forest sat at a crossroads. Just south of the city limits, Interstate 20 cut its way east to west across the state, carrying with it a constant stream of trucks, travelers, and transients. That stretch of highway was both a symbol of progress and an unspoken reminder of vulnerability. For a small town, a McDonald's franchise near the interstate was a point of pride, offering teenagers like Shondra May a rare opportunity for part-time work. But it also meant the community was never entirely insulated from the outside world. On the evening of Tuesday, February 4th, 1986, Shondra arrived at her shift at McDonald's, clocking in around 6 o'clock. It was a typical workday, with no indication that anything was amiss. By all accounts, she carried herself with the same warmth and dependability she was known for, traits that made her both a valued employee and a beloved daughter, friend, and classmate. Still, it was an unusually quiet night. A cold rain fell over the region, keeping many would-be customers at home. Business dwindled to the point that managers began to send employees home early. By 7:24 p.m., Shondra clocked out. She lingered for a short while, likely hoping that traffic might pick up enough to justify a few more hours. For a teenager working part-time, every hour counted, but the slow pace of the evening made that wish unrealistic. At 7:40 p.m., she decided to leave for the night. Before heading out, she picked up the restaurant phone and called her mother, Janelle, to let her know she was on her way home. It was an ordinary act, one that underscored her reliability and thoughtfulness. Yet, that simple phone call, casual and reassuring at the time, would become haunting in hindsight. It marked the last moment of certainty in Shondra's life. Shondra walked out into the damp evening air and climbed into her 1985 Isuzu Waymark, a small, efficient car that had become her companion on the many drives between home, school, and work. She left McDonald's, but instead of heading straight toward Pea Ridge, she made one short stop at the TGNY variety store in Forest. Witnesses later recalled seeing her there, picking out a large Valentine's Day card. It was a thoughtful purchase, perhaps for a close friend or family member, and the receipt for it would later be found among her belongings. Strangely, the card itself was never recovered. Back at the May family home in Pea Ridge, Janelle kept an eye on the clock. By now, she knew her daughter's routines well. The drive from Forest to their home should have taken no more than 20 minutes, even on a rainy night. But time began to stretch longer than it should. Anxiety, subtle at first, grew heavier with each passing minute. When Richard May called home that evening, checking in from his work on the river, Janelle confided her unease. Shondra was late, and there had been no word. Richard, accustomed to solving problems with a steady hand, advised Janelle to ask his brother, Shondra's uncle, to drive the route between Forest and Pea Ridge in case the Isuzu had broken down. Janelle moved to open the front door, perhaps to step outside and gather her thoughts before making that call. It was then that she noticed something chilling. Parked less than 100 yards away, visible from the May home, sat Shondra's car. It was an unsettling sight. Shondra should have been inside the house by now. Instead, her car was stranded just up the road, eerily close yet impossibly far. When family members approached the vehicle, the unease only deepened. The Isuzu's driver's side door was slightly ajar, left in a position that suggested abrupt departure. Inside, Shondra's purse remained, with most of its contents intact. Oddly, one thing was missing: her driver's license. That absence seemed deliberate, though its meaning was uncertain. The Valentine's card she had purchased was also gone. There were no signs of a struggle visible outside the car. No footprints, no dropped belongings, no clear evidence pointing to where Shondra might have gone. It was as if she had vanished into the night. News spread quickly among relatives, neighbors, and soon the wider community. In a rural area like Pea Ridge, people looked out for one another, and the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl hit like a shockwave. Search efforts began immediately. Family, friends, and volunteers combed the roadsides, woods, and ditches. Law enforcement was notified, and what began as a local concern quickly escalated into a matter of countywide urgency. The timing added another layer of dread. Shondra was just months away from graduation, her future stretching out ahead of her. She was known as a responsible, hardworking young woman, someone unlikely to run away or disappear voluntarily. Those who knew her best rejected any suggestion of rebellion or escapism. Something had happened, and whatever it was had interrupted her drive home within sight of her own front door. Investigators examined the car carefully, but beyond the missing items, there was little to go on. No broken glass, no blood, no obvious signs of foul play. Yet foul play seemed the only explanation. As word of Shondra's disappearance spread through Forest and Scott County, fear mingled with disbelief. Communities like Pea Ridge prided themselves on safety and familiarity. The notion that one of their own, particularly a teenager, could vanish so suddenly and violently was almost unthinkable. At Leak Academy, classmates struggled to comprehend what had happened. Teachers and students alike clung to hope that Shondra would be found safe, perhaps the victim of some bizarre misunderstanding. Yet, as hours turned into days, that hope dimmed. Authorities expanded their search. They scoured surrounding fields, wooded areas, and abandoned structures. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued. But the case was marked from the beginning by its absence of clarity. There was no clear suspect, no obvious motive, and no physical evidence strong enough to point investigators in a firm direction. Among the small details that surfaced, the Valentine's Day card stood out. Shondra had purchased it just before her disappearance, and yet it was never recovered. Its absence, paired with the missing driver's license, became one of the haunting details of the case. Were they taken by her killer as trophies, or had they been discarded somewhere, lost forever to the elements? For investigators, these missing items symbolized the gaps in the case itself. Every lead seemed to trail off into uncertainty, every clue incomplete. The discovery of the Valentine's card inside Shondra's abandoned car carried a quiet but haunting weight. Those who knew her well speculated that the card was for her boyfriend, 19-year-old Tony Adams of Edinburgh, Mississippi. Edinburgh lay some 27 miles northeast of Shondra's home in Pea Ridge, just far enough that the relationship had required effort. Adams, a student at Edinburgh High School, was close in age to Shondra, and their relationship was well known among her circle of friends. To those left behind, the presence of that card was both a tender reminder of her plans and a painful symbol of what she never got to deliver. But the card, like the rest of the vehicle, offered little in the way of clues. There was no sign of forced entry into her gray 1983 Oldsmobile Cutlass, no shards of glass, no evidence of a scuffle. The keys were missing, but the car itself sat quietly as if its driver had simply stepped out for a moment and failed to return. Law enforcement in Scott County was quickly drawn into the search once word of her disappearance spread. What began as a family's mounting worry quickly transformed into a multi-agency effort. The Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, MBI, was called in, and before long the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined as well. But on that first night, as officers and deputies fanned out, the mystery of the missing girl only deepened. Investigators were struck by what was missing from the scene rather than what was present. No tire tracks suggesting another vehicle had pulled alongside. No footprints pressed into the damp ground. No broken branches or torn clothing that might indicate a struggle. It was as if Shondra had driven within sight of her home, parked her car, and then vanished into thin air. By the following morning, word of Shondra's disappearance had surged through the small towns and rural communities of Scott and neighboring Lee County. Parents kept their children closer. Doors that had rarely been locked before were suddenly bolted at night. In Forest and Carthage, and in the back roads of Madden, the case was on everyone's lips. Flyers began to appear in store windows and on bulletin boards. Her smiling photograph, a senior portrait that captured her youth and promise, stared back from gas stations and diners. At McDonald's, where she had worked the evening shift the night she disappeared, co-workers taped her missing person poster by the counter where customers ordered. Clerks in local grocery stores wore small pins with her photo, a grassroots reminder that one of their own had vanished. Thousands of people kept watch in their own ways. Hunters walking the woods, farmers driving their fields, teenagers cruising the highways on Friday nights. Every set of eyes scanned the landscape for the faintest glimpse of Shondra or her belongings. In the space of a single night, her disappearance had transformed from one family's nightmare into a communal obsession. And yet, even with so many people looking, there was so little to find. A part of the problem lay in the way the initial site was handled. Like so many missing person cases of the time, law enforcement did not immediately treat Shondra's absence as suspicious. Decades of policy dictated that missing person reports were not taken as criminal investigations until 48 hours had passed, under the assumption that most cases involved voluntary runaways or temporary miscommunications. That protocol cost precious time. When Shondra's car was discovered near her home, relatives had already intervened. They had driven the Oldsmobile back to the house, unknowingly erasing any chance of preserving a pristine scene. Footprints that might have indicated direction or struggle were trampled by neighbors and family members. The car itself was never dusted for prints. Tire impressions on the roadside were left unmeasured. What might have been critical evidence was instead lost forever to consequence. It was a devastating misstep, though one not uncommon for its era. In the mid-1980s, forensic awareness was not as robust as it is today. Crime scene preservation, particularly in rural counties with limited resources, was far from standardized. A missing persons vehicle in a quiet community was seen as an unfortunate situation, not as the opening chapter in a homicide case. By the time the gravity of Shondra's disappearance set in, the trail was already compromised. In the days that followed, rumors swirled. Some whispered that she had run away, though those who knew her best dismissed the idea out of hand. Shondra had been bright, steady, and deeply rooted in her community. She had plans, obligations, and dreams she spoke about openly. The idea of her vanishing by choice never rang true. False leads surfaced, as they so often do in high-profile cases. A girl matching her description was seen walking along Highway 35. Someone else reported a vehicle resembling hers parked at a truck stop hours before the real discovery. Each tip raised hope, and each one ended in frustration. As February dragged on, the case grew heavier. Families in adjoining counties grew fearful, worrying that if something could happen to Shondra, it could happen to their own daughters. Parents watched the clock with dread when children were late returning from school. Strangers became more suspect. For the May family, every hour without word from Shondra was an agony beyond words. Day after day passed with no break. Shondra's absence stretched into weeks, and the February nights grew colder. By the time the month reached its final days, hope was dimming. Then on February 26th, 22 days after Shondra had last been seen, the case shifted from mystery to tragedy. The 26th of February was no ordinary date. It was Shondra's 18th birthday. Instead of celebration, it would mark the darkest chapter in the investigation. In Hinds County, west of Jackson, Mississippi, the land opened into thick woods and low-lying streams. In 1986, the area was even more remote, with scattered farmland broken by stretches of forest. Baker Creek wound its way quietly near the town of Bolton, crossing beneath Champion Hill Road just off Interstate 20. It was there, on that cold morning, that an off-duty fireman out hunting spotted something caught in the current. At first, it was difficult to discern exactly what the object was. Dark plastic garbage bags bobbed against the branches along the water's edge. The hunter's instinct told him it was wrong. Garbage seldom found its way so neatly packaged into a creek like this. Alarmed, he contacted local authorities. When deputies arrived, they waded into the icy water and pulled the object ashore. The plastic ripped, and the grim truth spilled into the open. Inside the bags were human remains, the battered body of Shondra May, missing for over 3 weeks. The discovery site was nearly 80 miles from her home in Scott County. The distance shocked investigators, suggesting not only premeditation, but also a deliberate attempt to obscure the crime. Baker Creek, isolated and shadowed by trees, was a place where secrets could linger. Tragically, it was not the first time bodies had been found in the area. The news traveled quickly. In Pea Ridge and Forest, in Madden, grief overtook hope. The smiling girl from the posters was gone. Families who had clung to optimism were left with devastation. And the May family was thrust into the nightmare no parent imagines. But with discovery came questions and mistakes. In 1986, forensic science was still decades away from the advances we take for granted today. DNA testing was in its infancy. Procedures for evidence handling were inconsistent. Just as the O.J. Simpson trial years later would highlight the devastating consequences of contaminated evidence, so too did Shondra's case suffer from limitations of the time. When her body was removed from the creek, opportunities for forensic preservation were missed. Whether fingerprints, fibers, or DNA could have been recovered remains uncertain. Some evidence was likely washed away by the water itself. Other potential traces may have been contaminated in the process of recovery. What could have been a crucial starting point for justice slipped instead into ambiguity. The phrase, "when one door opens, another one closes," became bitterly apt for the May family. The discovery of Shondra's body answered the question of where she had gone, but it also closed the door on the hope of bringing her home alive. Worse still, the mishandling of evidence cast long shadows over the possibility of identifying her killer. And so by the close of February 1986, what had begun as the disappearance of a bright, hard-working high school senior had become something darker. A rape, a murder, and a mystery that would stretch on for decades. The recovery of Shondra May's body from Baker Creek ended weeks of desperate searching. But in many ways, it was only the beginning of a darker chapter. For investigators, the focus shifted immediately from the where to the how and the why. The responsibility of answering those questions fell first to the medical examiner. The examination of her remains revealed haunting details about the final days of the bright, hard-working 17-year-old who had vanished within sight of her home. Shondra's body had been wrapped in black plastic garbage bags, a deliberate attempt to conceal and delay discovery. When those bags were carefully opened in the morgue, the examiner found that she had been bound and gagged. The bindings were not rope or chain, but something both ordinary and sinister. Industrial packing tape, the kind commonly used in poultry raising and processing facilities that dotted the region. For anyone familiar with central Mississippi's economy, that detail carried weight. Scott County and its neighbors were poultry country. Processing plants, farms, and distribution centers employed thousands of people. The tape wasn't unusual, it was everywhere. But the choice of material suggested someone who had direct access to it and who thought practically about restraint. To investigators, it was a clue that hinted at familiarity with the industry. To Shondra's grieving family, it was an unbearable reminder of how calculated her captivity had been. The initial autopsy, conducted under difficult conditions, given the state of the body after weeks in water, produced little in the way of firm conclusions. The official cause of death remained inconclusive, though signs of trauma were evident. That uncertainty frustrated her family and fueled speculation in the community. People wanted clarity, answers, and a sense of what Shondra had endured. Because of those gaps, a second autopsy was ordered by a separate medical authority. This time, the findings were more specific and more harrowing. Evidence of strangulation was identified. Bruising and pressure marks around her neck indicated that Shondra's life had been taken by force. The second examiner also confirmed what many had feared. There were signs of sexual assault. That combination, sexual assault, followed by strangulation, with the added details of binding and gagging, painted the picture of a prolonged and deliberate crime. This was no random disappearance followed by a hasty act of violence. Shondra had been restrained, held, and attacked. She had not died quickly. The timeline of her captivity only deepened the horror. Based on tissue condition and other post-mortem indicators, the examiner estimated that Shondra may have lived for as many as 17 to 19 days after her abduction. That meant that for nearly 3 weeks, while her parents and friends plastered her face across town, while law enforcement combed highways and backroads, Shondra may have still been alive. It was a detail almost too painful to bear. The possibility that she had been held captive in some hidden place, within driving distance of her home, gnawed at everyone connected to the case. Adding to the complexity, there was speculation about whether her body had been exposed to refrigeration at some point. If true, that could have slowed decomposition, making the exact timeline even murkier. Some investigators suggested she may have been dead sooner than the 19-day estimate, with refrigeration masking the true passage of time. Either way, the implication was chilling. Whoever had taken Shondra had the resources and the forethought to conceal her body before dumping it in Baker Creek. The forensic findings resolved one question, but opened 100 more. Shondra's whereabouts were no longer in doubt. But why had she been taken? And by whom? As in most homicide cases, suspicion first circled closest to home. Investigators looked hard at Shondra's father, Richard May, and at her boyfriend, Tony Adams. Both men were obvious points of focus, not because of evidence against them, but because statistics often point to family members or romantic partners in such crimes. For Richard, the suspicion was devastating. Already broken by the loss of his daughter, he now faced whispered questions about whether he had somehow played a role. Law enforcement questioned him thoroughly, examining his timeline, his relationship with his daughter, and his behavior in the days following her disappearance. Nothing incriminating surfaced. In time, he was cleared. Tony Adams, too, endured the burden of suspicion. The Valentine's card Shondra had purchased on the night she vanished fueled speculation that she had been planning to see him. Their relationship was young, typical of small-town teenagers navigating school, work, and the hope of futures beyond their county lines. Adams cooperated fully with investigators, providing statements and alibis. Ultimately, there was no evidence to suggest his involvement, and like Richard, he was cleared. For both men, the experience left lasting scars. Not only had they lost Shondra, but they had also been forced to prove their innocence under the crushing weight of grief. As investigators expanded their scope, rumors of a disturbing local figure began to surface. Around Meridian, Mississippi, reports had circulated of an individual posing as a police officer, pulling over young women and using the pretense of authority to trap them. Could Shondra have been stopped in a similar way? She had been driving home, close enough to her house to see its lights in the distance. If someone flashing a badge or using a mounted light had pulled her over, she might have rolled down her window, opened her door, and trusted the supposed officer. It was a compelling theory, but frustratingly thin. Despite interviews and tips, no hard evidence linked such a person to Shondra's case. Still, the story persisted in the community, stoking fears about imposters and authority figures who might abuse their roles. In the face of dead ends, investigators cast their net wide. They even looked inward, asking local law enforcement officers to take polygraph tests in an effort to rule out any insider involvement. The results yielded nothing of substance, but the fact that the step was taken showed how desperate the investigation had become. Years later, in August of 1992, a potential break seemed to emerge. Richard Weeks, then incarcerated in Missouri on unrelated forgery charges, was transported back to Mississippi for questioning about Shondra's murder. Weeks had prior ties to the region, having served time in Scott and Bolivar County jails in the late 1980s. To those following the case, the news brought a flicker of hope. Finally, there was a name, a concrete suspect who might offer answers. Weeks was interrogated extensively, but in the end, no new evidence arose. He was released without charges, leaving the case right where it had been for 6 long years, open, painful, and unsolved. The search for Shondra's killer was haunted by echoes of other crimes in Mississippi. On March 2, 1993, the Tuscaloosa News ran a story about potential ties between Shondra's case and that of Lori Hill, an 18-year-old Ellisville woman who had been murdered in February of that year. Hill, pregnant at the time, had been stopped by a man impersonating a police officer. She was strangled, and her body was dumped. The suspect in Hill's case was Kenneth McLean, a resident of Brandon, Mississippi. His name quickly made its way into conversations about Shondra May. The parallels were difficult to ignore. Young women's strangulation, impersonation of law enforcement, bodies dumped. McLean was also questioned in the murder of 24-year-old Chanda Feller, another Mississippi woman whose death bore similarities. The possibility of a serial offender moving through the region seemed plausible. Yet once again, the trail went cold. Charges against McLean in the Lori Hill case were dropped for lack of evidence. No physical ties, no confessions. No breakthroughs emerged to connect him to Shondra. By the mid-1990s, Shondra's case had become a painful symbol of both possibility and failure. Possibility, because every new suspect seemed like the one who might finally provide closure. Failure, because each lead fizzled into disappointment. Her family clung to the hope of answers. But as years turned into decades, that hope was tested. Shondra's story remained in newspaper archives, whispered in community conversations, and remembered by those who had known her. But her killer remained free, his identity cloaked in the shadows of time. Did Shondra know her abductor? The disappearance and death of Shondra May remains one of Mississippi's most haunting cold cases, not only because of the brutality of what happened to her, but also because of the chilling uncertainty surrounding one critical question. Did Shondra know the person who took her? It is a question that has tormented investigators, family, and armchair detectives for nearly 4 decades. If she knew her abductor, then her fate was sealed by misplaced trust. If she didn't, then she fell prey to a predator who wielded enough authority, or at least the illusion of it, to make her stop her car, step out, and vanish without resistance. The first detail that leaps out from the records is the eerie calmness of the vehicle. Shondra's car, left just a stone's throw from her home, told no story of panic or violence. No broken glass. No scratches or dents on the door. No overturned belongings. Her purse was still inside, undisturbed except for one notable absence: her license. This is where speculation begins. If Shondra had been attacked by a stranger, dragged from a car, or forced out against her will, there should have been chaos. Scratches, fingerprints, disturbed soil, tire marks of a struggle. Yet there was nothing. That silence, that lack of resistance, speaks volumes. It suggests one of two possibilities. Either she knew the abductor personally and felt no fear in stepping out of her vehicle, or she believed she was in the presence of authority, someone who had the power to compel her compliance without protest. The absence of her license complicates matters. At first glance, it seems minor, almost trivial. But in criminal investigation, even the smallest details can be the thread that unravels the entire story. Why was it missing from her purse? Did her abductor intentionally take it as a form of control, to know her address, to hold a piece of her identity, to intimidate her into obedience? That possibility aligns neatly with the theory of an impersonated police stop. A fake officer flashing a light, asking for license and registration, would immediately put Shondra in a position of compliance. Handing over her license could have been the first step in a deadly trap. But there's another possibility, one that law enforcement itself acknowledged. In the mid-1980s, it was common for young people to use their license frequently for checks or identification while shopping. Could Shondra have simply placed it in her coat pocket earlier that day and forgotten? If so, then its absence might mean nothing. A coincidence twisted into significance by hindsight. Yet coincidences are rare in murder cases. Investigators rarely accept them at face value. One of the most perplexing details is that Shondra's car came to a stop less than 100 yards from her house. She was almost home. She could have pulled into her driveway, shut the door behind her, and been in the safety of family. So why stop? The logical explanation is that she felt compelled to. The most common theory: flashing lights. If someone posed as law enforcement and initiated a stop, Shondra may have acted out of pure instinct to comply. It was drilled into drivers then, as it is now when police signal you stop. You don't roll into your driveway unless told otherwise. The haunting implication is this. If an impersonator staged a stop, then the abductor used authority, not force, to gain control of Shondra. That explains the absence of a struggle. That explains why she didn't just drive the remaining seconds into the safety of her yard. But here's the darker thought. What if she knew the person waving her down? What if it was a familiar car, a familiar face, someone she trusted enough to roll down the window, step out, and let her guard down? In the mid-1980s, rural Mississippi was no stranger to stories of men posing as officers. There were scattered reports across the state, headlights flashing, cars pulling over, only to find someone in plain clothes with a badge or a light rigged onto a car. In many communities, these impersonators used their false authority to harass or intimidate. One suspect, Kenneth McLean, was later investigated in connection to similar murders where the killer posed as law enforcement. McLean was accused of stopping women, impersonating an officer, and then strangling them. Though he was never convicted in Shondra's case, the parallels were chilling. Strangulation, sexual assault, the impersonation of police. Each detail fit uncomfortably into the same puzzle. If Shondra had indeed been targeted in this way, the abductor's strategy was terrifyingly simple. Use authority as a weapon. With one flashing light, one demand for license and registration. The predator didn't need force to subdue her, just her trust in the system. But the alternative theory is harder to dismiss. What if Shondra knew her abductor? The lack of struggle could just as easily point to familiarity. Someone she recognized, perhaps from her job, her school, or her community. Someone she trusted enough to pause for, to step out of the car, to allow herself to be near. Rural Mississippi in 1986 was a tightly knit place. People knew their neighbors, their classmates, their church members. Trust wasn't given lightly, but when it was, it carried weight. Could it have been someone who'd been watching her for weeks, waiting for the right moment? Someone who knew her schedule, her route, her habits? When her car stopped, was it because she saw someone she knew and rolled down her window willingly? If so, then the missing license becomes even more sinister. Perhaps not an impersonation at all, but a trophy. Something her killer kept, either to feel control or to relive the crime. Sadly, answers may have been buried in the mud that night. It had rained, softening the ground, leaving it ready to capture imprints of shoes or tires. But no such evidence survived. Not because it wasn't there, but because the scene was compromised. The car was moved by family before law enforcement arrived. Foot traffic trampled the site. Tire tracks, footprints, any trace of the abductor vanished under careless boots. What might have been a gold mine of evidence was lost forever. And so, decades later, investigators are left to reconstruct what cannot be physically proven. They lean on logic, psychology, and probability. Did she know him? Or did he convince her he was someone else entirely? For Shondra's family, the question isn't just about solving the case. It's about peace. If she knew him, then they grieve the betrayal of someone in their circle. If she didn't, then they grieve the randomness of a predator who could have struck anyone. Both answers are terrible, but one might at least close the book. For investigators, the weight is professional and personal. Detectives hate loose ends, and the Shondra May case is nothing but loose ends. The lack of DNA preservation, the failure to treat the site as a crime scene, the absence of hard leads, all of it leaves only speculation. And speculation, though it fuels documentaries and conversations, cannot convict. The reason this question, did she know her abductor, still haunts is because it is the fulcrum of the entire case. Every theory pivots on it. Every path to resolution depends on it. If she knew him, then her social circle becomes the hunting ground. Every friend, every coworker, every passing acquaintance is a suspect. If she didn't, then the predator was an outsider with a plan, someone using authority as a weapon. And because the evidence was lost, we may never know. In Edinburgh and beyond, people still whisper about that February night. Some are convinced she knew him. Others believe she was tricked by a fake officer. Everyone has their theory, shaped by fear, gossip, or proximity. And in that way, Shondra May never truly disappeared. Her name still circulates. Her face still remembered. her story still retold, not just as a victim of violence, but as a symbol of how fragile trust can be, and how dangerous authority becomes when used as a mask. On Tuesday morning, in the quiet stillness of a Madison County RV park, the echoes of a 39-year-old crime caught up with a man who had long lived in the shadows of suspicion. Reuben Week, 63 years old, was arrested for the abduction, rape, and murder of 17-year-old Shondra May, a high school senior whose disappearance and death in 1986 left the town of Forest, Mississippi, reeling in fear and heartbreak. For nearly 4 decades, the case had remained unsolved, a haunting reminder of how fragile justice can be, how evidence can fade, and how families can grow old waiting for answers that may never come. But on this Tuesday, when Scott County Sheriff Mike Lee arrived at Weeks RV with a caravan of officers, the long wait appeared to tilt toward closure. If Weeks was shocked, he didn't show it. Sheriff Lee later said the man had been fishing just the day before, but now sat calmly, requesting his wheelchair to be escorted to the squad car. To the sheriff, the scene felt almost surreal. The quiet arrest of a man accused of one of the most brutal crimes in county history. Shondra May wasn't just a name in a cold case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a classmate, a friend. At the time of her disappearance, she was a bright, hardworking 17-year-old senior at Leak Academy. She held down a job at McDonald's, balancing work and school like so many teenagers with her eyes on the future. On February 4th, 1986, Shondra clocked out from her shift and drove home along the familiar roads to her family's house in Scott County. But she never made it inside. Her car was found just short of the driveway, less than 100 yards from safety. Inside were her belongings undisturbed, except for one haunting detail. Her license was missing. For weeks, her family and the community held out hope. Posters with Shondra's smiling face lined store windows, bulletin boards, and telephone poles. Thousands of eyes scanned streets and back roads, praying for a miracle. But on February 26th, Shondra's 18th birthday, hope turned to horror. An off-duty fireman stumbled upon a suspicious bundle floating in Baker Creek near Bolton, Mississippi, 80 miles away. Wrapped in black garbage bags was Shondra's body, bound with tape commonly used in poultry plants across the region. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The discovery shattered her family, devastated her classmates, and planted a wound in Forest, Mississippi, that never healed. Despite the brutality of the crime, the investigation faltered almost from the beginning. The site where Shondra's car was found was never properly treated as a crime scene. Family members had moved the vehicle before law enforcement arrived, unintentionally disturbing potential evidence. Rain softened the ground, but investigators failed to preserve tire tracks or footprints. The car was never dusted for fingerprints. By the time state and federal agencies, including the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, were involved, critical evidence had already been lost. Over the years, multiple suspects were considered. Shondra's father, her boyfriend Tony Adams, even individuals posing as police officers in neighboring counties. Each lead raised hopes, only to collapse under lack of evidence. In 1992, authorities brought in Richard Weeks, a Missouri inmate with a history of forgery and connections to Mississippi. The name was chillingly familiar to locals, but no evidence tied him directly to Shondra's murder. Then in 1993, attention turned to another man, Kenneth McLean, accused of strangling Lori Hill, an 18-year-old pregnant woman in Ellisville, Mississippi, while posing as a police officer. McLean's alleged methods bore striking similarities to Shondra's case. But again, charges against him were eventually dropped. And so, the file grew thicker, but not clearer. Detectives retired. Witnesses died. Shondra's parents passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. For decades, her younger brother Tim carried the burden of unanswered questions alone. The tide began to shift when retired investigators, like Michael Frazier, refused to let the case die. Frazier, featured years ago in a WLBT segment, said he believed the key was persistence, pressing networking, and finding people who had once been silent but were now ready to talk. His instincts paid off. Over time, 3 witnesses came forward with testimony that cracked open the case. The details of what they revealed remained sealed within the investigation, but their voices breathed life back into a case many believed was destined to remain unsolved forever. Frazier later reflected on the moment, it all clicked into place. It led us to be able to find actually 3 witnesses that were present. So we were able to get a lot of information. It's like it just fell together. I just have to say it was God, brother. This fragile combination of persistence, faith, and timing reignited the case and put the spotlight squarely back on Reuben Weeks. On that Tuesday morning, Sheriff Mike Lee, a man who had once promised Scott County residents and Shondra's family that he would see this case solved, delivered on his word. When officers arrived at the RV park in Madison County, they found Weeks, now 63, living quietly. The man accused of a heinous act that had haunted generations was no longer the young man from the mid-1980s. He was older, slower, reliant on a wheelchair. Yet the charges, kidnapping, rape, and murder, carried the same crushing weight they did the day Shondra was found. Weeks did not resist. He asked for his wheelchair, was escorted to the squad car, and transported to jail. The scene was almost anticlimactic, the quietness of the arrest clashing against the brutality of the accusations. But for those who had lived in Shondra's absence, it was a thunderclap. For Tim May, now decades older than the sister he lost, the arrest was both a moment of relief and a reminder of time's cruel passage. Tim was 18 when Shondra disappeared. Their parents died without seeing justice served. For years, he carried their grief, waiting for a day he wasn't sure would ever come. When Sheriff Mike Lee was elected, he made a promise to the people of Scott County and to our family that he was going to solve this murder, Tim said. And he's kept good on his promise. There has been a bunch of people who have helped him keep good on his promise. For Tim, it wasn't just about the arrest. It was about keeping faith alive, honoring his sister's memory, and ensuring the story didn't fade into silence. The arrest of Weeks wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Sheriff Mike Lee addressed the public with a sharp warning. If anyone is out there that may be involved in this case and they're feeling like that just because we've made an arrest, it's over, don't feel safe. If you're out there, we're going to bring you in. His words carried a chilling implication that Reuben Weeks may not have acted alone. And if others were involved, justice would not stop with him. The message was clear. The past may be long, but it is not forgotten. Now begins a different kind of waiting. Weeks will make his way through the justice system. Arraignments, hearings, and eventually a trial. The legal process will stretch into months, possibly years, and with it will come renewed attention, reopened wounds, and difficult testimony. For Shondra's family, there will be no true closure. Closure is a myth in cases like this. But accountability, seeing someone finally answer for what happened, can be a step toward peace. The arrest of Reuben Weeks is not just about one man or one family. It is a reminder of how cold cases are never truly cold. They live on in files and memories and the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up. It highlights the power of witnesses, the importance of cooperation, and the value of promises kept. Sheriff Lee's commitment, backed by the persistence of retired detectives like Michael Frazier, turned a fading memory into an active case again. Most of all, it underscores a painful truth. Justice delayed is still justice. And sometimes, that is all families can hope for. Forest, Mississippi, is not the same town it was in 1986. Generations have passed. Roads have changed. Businesses have come and gone. But the memory of Shondra Denise May has never left. She is remembered as the smiling high school senior with her whole future ahead. A daughter who never came home. A sister whose absence shaped an entire family. And now, nearly 4 decades later, her name is tied once again to the headlines, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a case finally moving toward justice. For her brother Tim, for Sheriff Lee, for Michael Frazier, and for the community that carried her memory through the years, the arrest of Reuben Weeks is a moment of reckoning. Shondra's story will never be undone, but perhaps at last, it can be honored with truth. And now that you've heard every detail of Shondra May's case, let me leave you with this. Silence is dangerous. In America, too many stories like Shondra's get buried, forgotten, and ignored until they're nothing more than a faded headline. That's how predators win, because people stop paying attention. But you don't have to let that happen. By subscribing, by sharing, you keep Shondra's memory alive. You remind the world that she mattered, that her life was stolen, and that justice is still owed. Ask yourself this. If Shondra were your sister, your daughter, your best friend, would you want people to just walk away after hearing her story? Or would you want them to take action, to remember her name, and to make sure the next victim isn't forgotten? Don't close this video without doing something. Subscribe now, stand up, and make sure America never forgets Shondra May.